European Union using a legal authority
Fentanyl tariffs on Canada, both
labor,
that will fall upon people.
Maintains and sustains
came into force at almost exactly the same moment, and Canada is now among the countries covered by it. The Canadian government has rejected the reasoning outright. Canada's trade minister has said plainly that Ottawa does not agree with the measure, and that Canada already maintains some of the strongest provisions in the world on forced labor. The United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer argues the opposite. In the next few minutes, I will take you through what the new duty actually does, why Washington says it was necessary, how Canada and other governments are responding, and what still has not been settled.
Other countries to act on this. Finally, we have put our foot down and we have told countries, you need to take action, you need to prohibit the import of goods made with forced labor.
Let me start with the mechanics, because the timing here is unusually tight. The 10% global tariff that had been in place lapsed overnight. Rather than leaving that gap open, the new forced labor duty took effect immediately, keeping a 10% charge in place on affected goods. In practical terms, many importers saw one justification replaced by another without a pause in the middle. The legal basis changed. The rate did not. That distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to plan shipments, price contracts, or challenge the measure, because a tariff's legal foundation determines who can contest it, on what grounds, and how long that process is likely to take. The new levy is a 10% charge applied to goods that Washington describes as not compliant with free trade obligations. Mr. Greer has laid out the rationale in direct terms. He has pointed to provisions on forced labor that the United States pressed Canada and Mexico to adopt as part of their trade commitments, and he has said Washington is finding those prohibitions are not actually being enforced. That is the core of the American argument. It is not, according to that framing, a claim that Canada lacks rules on paper. It is a claim about whether those rules are being applied in practice. Ottawa's response has been to reject the premise. Canada's trade minister has said the government does not agree with the tariffs, which fall under what is known in the United States as Section 301. For viewers who have not encountered that term before, Section 301 is a provision of American trade law that allows the United States government to investigate practices it considers unfair and to impose duties in response. It gives a president considerable room to act without new legislation from Congress. That is precisely why it appears so often in modern trade disputes, and why the countries on the receiving end so often find it difficult to challenge quickly. The Canadian minister's central point was that Canada's own protections against forced labor are among the strongest available. That is a rebuttal of substance rather than tone. It does not dispute that forced labor in global supply chains is a serious problem. It disputes the idea that Canada is the weak link, and it sets up the disagreement that now sits at the center of this dispute. Not whether forced labor should be prohibited, but whether Canada is genuinely enforcing the prohibition it agreed to.
Proposed issuing 10 to 12.5% tariffs on 59 nations and the European Union using a legal authority known as Section 301 over the quote.
What stands out to me is how quickly the objection spread beyond North America. This is not framed as a Canada-specific measure. It reaches multiple economies at once, and several governments have pushed back publicly. A European voice questioned the forced labor justification directly, arguing that the argument simply cannot be applied to the European Union. An Australian official described the imposition of higher tariffs on Australia as completely unjustified. Those are notably firm words from governments that normally choose their language carefully when discussing Washington. The pattern suggests the objection is not only to the rate, but to the reasoning used to support it. There is a reason that reasoning provokes such a strong reaction. A tariff justified on forced labor grounds carries an implication about a country's domestic standards. It is not a neutral economic instrument in the way a broad across-the-board duty is. For governments in the European Union and Australia, accepting the premise even partially would mean conceding that their labor enforcement is inadequate.
We have processes, we have agencies that go through, do investigations, and we identify companies and countries that have a prevalence of forced labor, and we stop those goods at the border and we don't let them in.
That is a political cost separate from the financial one, and it helps explain why the responses have been so pointed rather than merely regretful. China has also been captured by the new duty, and that part of the story carries a different weight. Beijing has faced sustained international criticism over allegations involving forced labor among the Uyghur ethnic minority.
To commit to implementing these laws, and even within the past week or two, we've seen a number of countries come in to implement these laws. So this is something that's gone on for a long time.
Allegations the Chinese government has consistently rejected. In response to this latest measure, the Chinese government has not offered any commitment to change labor practices. Its public position has instead been the familiar argument that trade wars serve no one's interests. That is a notable contrast with the European and Australian responses, which engaged with the forced labor claim itself, rather than sidestepping it. That contrast leads directly to a complication for Ottawa. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney has been working to strengthen trade ties with Beijing.
Failure to address the importation of goods made with forced labor. So let's talk about it. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer joins.
Beijing. Those two developments now sit uncomfortably close together. Canada is being told by Washington that it is not enforcing forced labor rules firmly enough, at the same time as it seeks deeper commercial engagement with a country facing its own forced labor allegations. Neither track is necessarily incompatible with the other, but the overlap creates an obvious line of political attack, and it raises questions the government will be pressed to answer. A former Canadian diplomat who served in China has voiced exactly that concern, warning that the government needs to take action. According to that assessment, units inside the Canadian government dedicated to tracking products made with forced labor have been reduced since Mr.
But the Chinese government not pledging to make any labor changes, only saying trade wars are not in anyone's interest.
Welcome.
As the Prime Minister
Carney took office, I want to be careful with how I frame that. It is a claim made by a former official, not a confirmed government accounting of staffing levels, and Ottawa has not publicly detailed those internal numbers in the material available. But it is a claim that speaks directly to Washington's argument, because the American case rests on enforcement capacity rather than on the existence of rules. To understand why enforcement has become the central issue, it helps to look at what Canada agreed to earlier. Forced labor prohibitions were built into the trade commitments that Canada and Mexico entered with the United States at American insistence. That means the obligation is not new and is not disputed. What is disputed is performance. When a country signs an enforcement commitment, it accepts that its partners can measure it against results rather than intentions. That is the standard Washington is now invoking, and it is a demanding one, because supply chain enforcement is slow, technical, and difficult to demonstrate publicly. Ottawa has moved on the legislative front, and the timing is worth noting. Under scrutiny from the United States, the Canadian government introduced a bill last month that would require importers to prove that the products they bring into the country were not made through slavery. That is a significant shift in approach. Under a proof of origin standard of that kind, the burden moves onto the importer to demonstrate a clean supply chain, rather than onto authorities to prove a violation after the fact. In principle, that makes enforcement far more practical. But here is the crucial qualification, and it is central to Washington's argument. There is no timeline for when that change would become law. A bill introduced is not a bill passed. It has to move through debate, committee study, votes in the House of Commons, and passage through the Senate before it has any legal effect. Until that happens, it changes nothing for importers or exporters. One Canadian voice in the debate has argued that it is important to get the legislation onto the floor of the House of Commons and to have a thorough debate on it. That is a call for the process to begin in earnest, which tells you something about where the process currently stands. That brings us to the practical question many viewers will be asking. What does a 10% duty actually mean for people, rather than for governments? A tariff is collected at the border from the importer, not from the exporting government. That cost then travels through the chain. Some of it may be absorbed by the exporter through lower prices, some by the importer through thinner margins, and some may reach consumers. Which of those happens depends on the product, the competition, and how long the duty stays in place. I want to be clear that I cannot tell you how that will be distributed because that outcome has not yet been documented. The more immediate effect is uncertainty. Businesses that ship goods across the Canada-United States border operate on contracts, forecasts, and inventory schedules that assume stable duty rates.
From American complaints over Canadian wildfire smoke is on the table. Jillian Piper, Global News, Ottawa.
When a tariff's legal basis changes overnight and a further increase is being discussed publicly, planning becomes considerably harder. That difficulty tends to be felt most acutely by smaller exporters, who have fewer resources to absorb sudden cost changes or to restructure their supply arrangements quickly.
Thursday night, only to be replaced by these latest forced labor tariffs. Business groups say while the immediate impact is limited,
larger firms usually have more room to adjust, though they are not insulated either. There is also a broader issue of scope. Because the duty applies to goods described as non-compliant with free trade obligations, a great deal depends on how that category is defined and administered in practice. Two shipments of similar products could be treated differently depending on documentation and sourcing. That kind of administrative complexity often becomes the real story in tariff disputes, well after the headline rate has been announced. The available information does not set out the full technical detail of how compliance will be assessed, and that is one of the gaps worth watching closely. Now let me turn to what may be the most consequential part of this report, because the current 10% may not be where this ends. A separate United States duty of 50% on Canadian goods could take effect next month. That is a fundamentally different order of magnitude. A 10% charge is a cost pressure that many exporters can attempt to manage. A 50% charge can make entire product lines commercially unviable in the American market. I want to be precise here. That measure has been signaled as possible, not confirmed as implemented, and it has not yet taken effect. Trump has also raised the prospect of another tariff altogether, one connected to American complaints about wildfire smoke drifting from Canada. He has said such a measure is on the table. That framing is worth pausing on, because it links a trade instrument to an environmental grievance rather than to a commercial dispute. It has not been implemented, and no details of how it would function have been laid out in the available information. But its mention illustrates something important about the current environment. Tariffs are being discussed as a general-purpose tool for a widening set of complaints. For Canada, that widening scope creates a strategic problem. Responding to one tariff on its legal merits is one thing. Preparing for a sequence of tariffs arriving from different directions, on different justifications, is considerably harder. Each measure requires a separate response, a separate legal assessment, and a separate diplomatic track. Ottawa's approach so far has been to reject the forced labor rationale while advancing its own legislation, which addresses the substance of the complaint without conceding the premise behind the tariff. Whether that combination is enough to change Washington's position remains unclear. The political dimension inside Canada adds another layer. The Carney government now faces pressure from two directions on the same issue. Washington is arguing that Canadian enforcement is insufficient. Domestic critics, including the former diplomat I mentioned earlier, are raising concerns about reduced capacity to track goods linked to forced labor. Those two pressures point toward the same remedy, which is stronger and faster enforcement. That may make the path forward clearer politically, even if it does not make the tariff disappear. There is a further consideration for how quickly Ottawa can act. Passing legislation that shifts the burden of proof onto importers involves real administrative work. Border authorities need capacity to assess claims. Importers need guidance on what documentation satisfies the standard. Companies need time to audit their own supply chains. Even with strong political will, that machinery does not appear overnight. This is one reason enforcement disputes tend to persist longer than tariff announcements suggest, and why a bill without a timeline is treated by trading partners as an incomplete answer. Let me address the question of what has actually been established, because in fast-moving trade stories that line is easy to lose. What is confirmed is that a new 10% duty tied to forced labor allegations has taken effect, replacing the expired 10% global tariff. What is confirmed is that Mr. Greer has justified it on enforcement grounds, and that Canada's trade minister has rejected that reasoning. What is confirmed is that European, Australian, and Chinese responses have all been critical, in different registers.
That tariff, that tax.
And that's why that type of tariff doesn't come in for several years. The point is, a lot of these...
What is confirmed is that Canada introduced legislation last month with no timeline for passage. What remains unresolved is more substantial. It is not yet clear whether the 50% duty will take effect next month, or whether it will be modified, delayed, or set aside. It is not clear whether the tariff connected to wildfire smoke will move beyond discussion.
We have to compete with that. That's not fair to our workers. It's not fair to our unions. And that's why we've had Democrats and Republicans for many years call for enforcement action on this very issue.
But you don't actually think that the United States...
It is not clear whether Canada's proposed importer legislation will pass, or when, or whether Washington would regard it as sufficient. And it is not clear how the affected countries will coordinate their responses, if at all, given that several are objecting to the same measure simultaneously. One possible outcome is that Canada accelerates its legislation, secures passage, and uses that as the basis for seeking relief from the duty. That would depend on parliamentary scheduling, on the bill surviving debate largely intact, and on Washington accepting new legislation as evidence of enforcement rather than waiting to see results. Another possibility is that the dispute escalates through the additional tariffs already signaled. A third is that the measure is contested through legal and trade dispute channels, which would take considerably longer than the political timelines involved. I also want to note the international dimension, because it may shape what happens next more than any single bilateral exchange. When a tariff is applied simultaneously to Canada, the European Union, Australia, and China on a shared justification, the affected governments have a common interest in disputing the reasoning, even where they disagree with each other on other matters. Whether that translates into any coordinated action has not been established, but the breadth of the pushback is itself a factor Washington will have to weigh, and it distinguishes this measure from a narrowly targeted dispute.
The Trump administration is praying that the third time's the charm when it comes to the president's tariff agenda. You might remember, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down his...
Bringing this back to where it began, the essential development is straightforward even if the consequences are not. A 10% duty justified by allegations of unenforced forced labor prohibitions is now in effect, and Canada is subject to it. Ottawa disputes the justification and says its own protections are among the strongest anywhere. Its remedy legislation exists, but has not become law. And a much larger 50% duty remains a live possibility for next month, alongside another measure that has been raised but not implemented. This story deserves continued attention for a simple reason. The current rate is not the ceiling, the legal basis is contested, and the timeline for Canada's own response is undefined. Any one of those three could shift in the coming weeks, and each would change what this means for exporters, importers, and eventually consumers on both sides of the border. The next meaningful signals to watch are whether Canada's bill reaches serious debate in the House of Commons and whether the 50% duty is confirmed, delayed, or dropped. Thank you for watching my report on the new 10% United States forced labor tariff and Canada's rejection of the reasoning behind it. This remains an unfinished story, with a much larger duty still under discussion and Canada's own enforcement legislation still awaiting passage. If you want to follow what happens next as those decisions are made, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so that each verified update on this trade dispute reaches you as soon as it is available.